Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to let everybody know that we'll get started right at the top of the hour. Okay, it looks like it's noon, so let's go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everyone today to part 2 of our panel series, Supporting the Mental Health of Refugee and Asylee Communities. We thank you for your interest in today's panel session. Next slide, please. Today, we have a special panel session on supporting the mental health of refugee and asylee communities. This is part 2. Yesterday in part 1, we had 3 panelists with lived experience speak, and today we have 90 minutes, and we're going to be sharing our time with 3 panelists who support these communities. Next slide, please. As we get ready to dive into these stories, we want to share with all of our participants today that at the Mhttc network, one of our goals is to utilize affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all of the work we are involved in. As we move through this panel series, we hope all will remain mindful of the many different perspectives that may come up in these discussions. We kindly ask everyone to communicate with one another during this learning series and outside of this space using language that is respectful, non-judgmental, inclusive, and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, and experiences. Next slide. Thank you. And a few reminders to help everyone get settled in today. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted with slides to our Mhttc website within a week from today. Everyone here, you'll also receive a notification by email. And if you missed yesterday's session or you weren't able to tune in for the full time, that will also be made available on the website and emailed out. Also, today you were all muted and your video is off, so no need to worry about that. And I'd like everyone to take a look at the Zoom toolbox on the bottom of your screen. I know at this point, most of us are professionals with Zoom, but just a few reminders for you that we're going to be using the chat box to have back and forth discussions, share resources, and you can check in with us if you're having any tech issues. If you have a question, however, for our panelists, we'd like you to put that in the Q&A box. And if you do put a question for the panelists in the chat box, we'll just redirect you to copy it into that Q&A box. The last thing I want you to look at down there is we do have closed captioning available. You're just going to go ahead and click that CC icon if you'd like to enable the captions. Certificates of attendance will be available for today's session if you view 50% or more. So that's going to be 45 minutes. And I know yesterday we had some people ask about if they got kicked off and had to log back in or had to switch devices. As long as you have a total of 45 minutes showing up in the session, you will receive that certificate. And we will not be offering CEUs for this event. Now, here's an overview of what we have planned today. First, we're going to start with an overview of the Mhttc network and the Building Health Equity and Cultural Responsiveness Working Group. Then we'll go over the objectives and purpose for today's session. We'll introduce our panelists. Then we're going to have about 20 minutes. Then we'll hear from all 3 of our panelists as they share about themselves and their work as it relates to the importance of mental health supports for refugee and asylee communities. And then we'll have our Q&A session. And we're hoping to have about 20 minutes for that, where you can submit your questions into the Q&A box and have those answered live. Then we will have a wrap-up activity and share our next steps. So with that being said, let's get started with our introduction to MHTTC. So the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network, also known as the MHTTC network, accelerates the adoption and implementation of mental health-related evidence-based practices across the nation. We do this by developing and disseminating mental health resources, providing free local and regional training and technical assistance, and increasing the awareness, knowledge, and skills of the mental health workforce. Our network includes 10 regional centers, a national American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a national Hispanic and Latino center, and a network coordinating office. And we invite you to find the center that serves you by either taking a look at this map or visiting our MHTTC website. That should be linked in the chat shortly. And for those of you from Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, or Kansas, I am from the Mid-America MHTTC Region 7, and we serve your 4 states. Christina, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shelby. I have the pleasure of working in Region 10, which is Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, where I'm located. That's hilarious. But we're so excited to be with you today. And if you did miss yesterday's event, please do watch it when we get the recording up. It was really fantastic. So I have also had the humble pleasure to be working with the Building Health Equity and Cultural Responsiveness Working Group. So we have representation from all across our network with the goal to disseminate culturally appropriate information and provide technical assistance for the mental health field to improve access to culturally responsive services. In previous years, we've developed resource collections that highlight racial equity and cultural diversity. We have also led a learning series where we engaged in an interactive conversation about culturally inclusive mental health practices. For the current grant year, what we're doing right now, our group met and chose specifically to work on the mental health needs of asylum seekers and refugee populations. Recognizing and appropriately responding to the mental health needs among asylum seekers and refugees pose a challenge because of differences in language, culture, as well as specific stressors and trauma associated with the migration and resettlement processes. So we also know we lack the workforce capacity to adequately support these populations. And so these exponential effects really challenge leaders in trying to mitigate mental health conditions within these communities and newfound community members. So as a response to do our part that we could, we wanted to host these 2 sessions. Monday was World Refugee Day, and a former person working on our group really brought this home and was the inspiration for why we are holding these events this week. So we just want to always honor the strength and the courage and resilience of those that have been through this process. Through this series of 2 sessions, we wanted to raise awareness about relevant mental health needs and highlighting their voices and stories, which we did yesterday. We wanted to share best practices and strategies with providers and organizations using contextual and system level perspectives. So that's today's session. And then throughout, differentiating between having a cultural knowledge base and having actual culturally responsive approaches. So we begin to address these objectives for the second part to get to our systems panel. And so we're excited to go. So it is my pleasure to welcome our panelists, and if they want to go ahead and unmute and come on camera, I will make sure that I can see everybody's here. There they are. So we're just going to have folks do just a little 1 to 2 minute introduction to their background and current role. And then we will, as mentioned before, each of them will have about 15 minutes to share their thoughts and experience, and then we'll get to Q&A. So I'll start with Erman, if you want to go first. Good morning.
Thank you, Christina. And hello, everyone. Welcome. It is an honor to be here with all of you and to get to talk about this topic. My name is Germán Cadenas. Pronouns are he, his, él, and I am a faculty member of Counseling and Psychology at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. And I am an immigrant myself. I am originally from Venezuela, and my family and I migrated to the US when I was 15 years old. Like many immigrants and many refugees and asylum seekers, we came to the US trying to get away from very difficult conditions and trying to seek a better life. Unfortunately, the refugee program was not something that we could qualify for. And so we were undocumented, and there was no pathway for us to be able to adjust our status. And I say this to bring attention to 11 million undocumented immigrants who have no pathway to have some form of protection. And so much of my work focuses on immigration, supporting immigrants, refugees, with a focus on undocumented immigration. So lovely to be here today.
Thank you so much for coming. Kashif.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kashif Ahmed. I'm a fifth-year child psychiatry fellow at the Yale Child Study Center and the Yale New Haven Hospital. My current refugee work is with our pediatric refugee population here in New Haven, Connecticut. Our kids are mainly from Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, Rwanda, Syria, Venezuela, where Germán is from, and Iraq. And so I work with some of the local nonprofits and refugee resettlement agencies here in town to mainly try to develop culturally informed programming for the refugee kids through some longitudinal age-based youth groups and some summer camps and things like that. And then also work in our pediatric refugee clinic doing mental health screenings for kids right after they arrive in country. And then back in medical school, my work was mainly working to build longitudinal mental health interventions for orphan kids in Sri Lanka. So I was there for 2014 and 2015. So that's some of my background with respect to refugee and immigrant populations, but I'm really excited to share some of the lessons I've learned, but just as importantly, to learn from you all and to learn from my co-panelists. So I'm happy to be here. Oh, Christina, you're on mute.
Yes, it was brilliant. Whatever I said. No, thank you, Kasha, for your introduction. Appreciate it. All right, Kira.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kira Maseth. I'm a clinical psychologist in Washington State, and I'm coming today to participate and to learn from my fellow panelists around sort of the clinical aspects of doing local and international refugee support. I've done quite a bit of work in the context of international disaster relief, and that could be for either externally or internally displaced persons, starting in Haiti, working in Jordan with Syrian refugees, and also most recently in Poland with Ukrainian refugees, and focusing on similar things to what Kashif was mentioning around culturally competent psychological support and mental health support that is, accessible, meaningful, and not strictly from a Eurocentric sort of lens that is actually helpful for folks. So that's my work, and I'm looking forward to participating today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kira. We've had the pleasure in our region to work with Kira quite a bit. And so I'm very, very grateful you could be here today. And you also connected us with someone who was on our panel yesterday, which was just astounding and really an amazing story. So thank you for your continued contributions to our work. So for this session, we are trying to have folks share your experience and expertise learning about the needs. And so I think specifically for the systems and strategies, what are the similarities and differences between refugee and asylum seeking populations? Why is there migration? Who are the populations migrating in recent years? What barriers do people find when they start arriving and starting their lives in the US? Then looking at the impact of systems and legal processes on mental health as people experience this process, and what experiences of trauma do communities face during this process and resettlement? What does that mean for folks' mental health? And then increased capacity and access for culturally responsive trauma-informed services and support. So what are the immediate mental health needs that folks are facing? We heard a little bit about that yesterday, but what are some of the cultural considerations to keep at the forefront? So with all this, that's what we've asked you all to ponder before coming to our panel. And so I know we're going to start next with Kashif with some slides that you have. So I will get going on that.
All right, so I'm going to share some lessons that I've learned and sort of key takeaways from some of the work that I've done. But I'd love for this to be, something where I learned from you all as well. And with a lot of work in mental health, as you all know, there's not necessarily a single right answer for a lot of these things. And so feel free to post your questions, comments, criticisms, whatever it is in the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll be able to talk through some of these things together. But I think we can go to the next slide. So one thing that I try to focus on when working with refugee families is managing my own expectations, because there's so much that we're trying to address when we're working with people from cultures that are different than our cultures of origin. And so if you imagine, working with a family that's newly arrived in the US, you're seeing them in your office, your clinic, and there's 2 or 3 cute little kids running around the exam table and jumping off of stuff. And the family has just navigated a new bus system to get to this appointment on time. They're tired. They're communicating with you through an interpreter who may or may not speak their exact language. They may be coming from a culture where there's a much more pronounced stigma around mental health than what we're accustomed to, even in our society that also has a significant stigma. And so there's so many stressors that these families are dealing with on top of all of the traumas from the pre-migration, migration, and post-migration phases of their journey. And so they may not have the emotional bandwidth right off the bat to discuss a lot of sensitive issues with someone that they've just met. And now on top of all of that, they may have concerns about whether this conversation that they're about to have is going to jeopardize sort of their legal status or things like that. There may be social repercussions that they're thinking about if the interpreter is somebody who's from the same cultural community that they're sort of joining. And so that there's just a lot that these families are dealing with. And so it's important for us to not bite off more than we can chew, and to really focus on what are the parts of this interaction that are going to do the most good for this family today, over the next week, and thinking long term. And so really it's about trying to establish some trust that mental health providers can offer a safe space to talk about difficult things. And sometimes I tell myself, if I can just do that in the first few sessions, then I've hit it out of the park. I've done what I've needed to do, because that's really the key. And again, many of these families might be coming from cultures in which mental health conversations are things that only happen within a family or with a respected elder or with a faith leader, but there may not be a pre-existing notion of a mental health professional who can support somebody through psychotherapy or psychopharmacology, both of which might be completely unfamiliar concepts for some of our families that we're working with. And so I try to just remind myself to focus on the 3 things in this slide. If I can listen meaningfully to what the family or the child is sharing about their experiences in their own words, without trying to sort of like automatically superimpose my Western sort of concepts about diagnoses or treatments, and I can just really hear what they're saying with their own cultural concepts in play, then that's sort of a job well done, because there are these linguistic barriers that we're trying to navigate with the interpreter, but there's also cultural paradigms that we're trying to learn about and understand, because every culture has their own ways in which mental health is experienced internally, the way that it manifests externally, the way it's treated. And then there's a ton of variation within cultures as well, from region to region, from family to family, from sibling to sibling. And many of the cultural paradigms that our patients come to us with are much different than what we're used to in the West. And in fact, I would argue that they're much richer oftentimes and much more nuanced than our sort of DSM model of mental health that sort of traces its roots back just about 100 years and is not informed by as many thinkers and contributors as some of the cultural paradigms that our patients are familiar with. And so taking the time to really understand those cultural frameworks is huge. And I think the second thing that I try to remind myself is to really focus on validating the experiences that they're sharing, both in terms of the traumas that they've been through, but also subjectively what they're feeling right now. And to just say something like, what you're experiencing is a normal human response to an abnormally hard situation, or something like there's a lot of people who are struggling with the same kind of thing that you're describing, who've been through similar things. And that kind of validation can just go a really long way for people who may not have ever heard that from somebody outside of their family or their religious community. And so to hear that from a professional that they're going to have an ongoing relationship with, hopefully can be really meaningful and can do a lot to sort of build some momentum for really fruitful conversations going forward. And then the third thing is to not assume that our clients or our patients have an implicit understanding of how our services work in the West. The idea of even like follow-up appointments or psychotropic medications or psychotherapy, I think it really is worth taking the time to explain, like logistically, not like theoretically, like psychodynamic. I mean, just logistically, what is actually happening during a psychotherapy session? What's the purpose? I think it really is worth spending the time in our first few interactions with families, explaining what we can offer to them, so that they don't feel like they're being asked to disclose these really vulnerable things without some hope that we can be with them as they process those things and support them and things like that. So why don't we go to the next slide? I guess one thing that always comes up when we're talking about doing mental health work with refugee families is how to elicit a patient's trauma history and when it's appropriate to do that. And sometimes patients want to talk about it right off the bat, despite all of these barriers that we just discussed. Sometimes in the first meeting, they really are ready to dive in and talk about difficult things they've been through. But sometimes it takes a long time, and that's okay. And so I really try to follow the family's lead in terms of what they would like to do, what they want to talk about. And if I ever feel like I need to sort of pick between focusing on a family or a kid's current functioning or eliciting sort of their past experiences, I tend to focus on their current functioning. If I can figure out how to help this kid get acclimated to his new school setting or deal with the sleep issues that he's having right now, I'd rather do something that's going to be helpful for him in the moment and then sort of table or punt the conversations about past traumas if that feels appropriate. And so we'll go to the next slide. When I think about eliciting that trauma history, whenever it feels appropriate to do that, I tend to group it into these three categories, and other people have different ways of conceptualizing this. But for me, it's sort of like there's a pre-migration phase, there's the migratory phase itself, and then there's the post-migration. Sometimes if you look at other people's literature, they'll call this like resettlement, or they'll use different terms. But this is sort of a common model in which we categorize things into these three buckets to make it easier for the families to sort of think about their journey and also for us to understand what they're coming in with. So we'll go to the next slide and talk about sort of the pre-migration phase. And I'll give you guys some examples of the questions that I might focus on, and also where I tend to get tripped up, because a lot of these are things that I've missed in the past. And so I'm gonna hopefully you guys will learn from some of my slip-ups. And so thinking about where a family is migrating from, it's important to also ask about moves within the country that they're coming from. So if the intake paperwork, for example, says that this family is from Kabul, Afghanistan, and I just assume that that's where they're from, that's where they've always lived. I might miss the fact that they've only lived there for 6 months before they moved, and actually they'd spend the rest of their lives in a rural part of Eastern Afghanistan that would come with its own sort of set of psychosocial stressors. And then also a lot of the families that we're working with outside of a Western or Eurocentric context are coming from more collectivist cultures than what we're familiar with in the US. And so it's really important to understand who did they live with and who were the important people in their lives and what kind of domicile. So a lot of my patients, for example, from Afghanistan, live in these big sort of family compounds with 40 or 50 people all living in the same, I guess you could call it a neighborhood, with aunts and uncles, grandparents, nieces, nephews, a bajillion cousins, all sort of living in these houses with like a shared courtyard. And that's a very different setup than, for example, my kids who've lived most of their lives in like a refugee camp or something like that. And so understanding even the type of domicile can clue you into potential stressors to screen for. And then understanding a little bit about what the parents have done for work. Obviously, many of the families that are granted asylum, for example, are able to do so because the parents oftentimes have worked for the US government or military in some capacity. And that's important to understand too, because it'll come up later when we talk about their resettlement in the US and discrimination and things like that. Understanding the amount of schooling that kids have had is not something we should take for granted. Just because a kid is 10 years old doesn't mean that they've been in school for 5 years, for example. And this can vary across genders and sort of in different cultures of origin. There are different norms in regard to length of schooling, and so it's important to understand that as we help kids get settled into their new school systems. And then this is something I get tripped up on a lot, is we often ask about, the scary things that have happened to you or to your loved ones, and we focus on the thing that's in the news. So like what happened when the Taliban took Kabul, or when the Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, or whatever, when the hurricane hit. We tend to focus on those things. And we sometimes miss all of the stresses that we should be screening for that are not particular to that thing that's in the news. So domestic violence in the home, bullying in school, all those kinds of the effects of just multi-generational poverty, all these things that we ask all of our clients about are worth incorporating and asking about in part of this pre-migration screening as well. So then we'll talk a little bit about the migration phase. And so some of the things I try to ask are whether the family chose to leave or were forced to. Was it a planned move or was it spontaneous? And oftentimes these things sort of exist on a continuum, and sometimes it's not one or the other. It's sort of this blend of the two, but understanding what that felt like for the family and how much agency they had is important. We always ask about who came with you, but sometimes we forget about who was left behind, which important family members were not able to make the journey, and what was left behind in terms of professions or social standing or whatever it might be. Those things are important to understand as well. And to not assume that the journeys were necessarily made by plane. A lot of our families have come by boat, by foot, by many other means. And so it's important to understand these pieces as well. A lot of people have not made a direct sort of journey from their country of origin to the US. Many people have had long stays in refugee camps in other countries. And so understanding those experiences are important as well. And then even just getting a sense for how they were greeted when they arrived in the US. Was it a welcoming, inclusive, sort of inviting thing, or were they strip searched and it was a really sort of harrowing experience? Even understanding those pieces can be really important. I try to make a point of reminding patients or reassuring them that whatever they share in this portion of our conversation isn't going to jeopardize their ability to remain in country, because that's a legitimate fear that a lot of patients or clients may have. And so if it's the case where you're working, it's really important to reassure them that those conversations aren't going to jeopardize their status. And then the post-migration phase is a really key thing to focus on, because a lot of the research actually shows, and Christine, if you want to go to the next, oh yeah, there we go, post-migration. So a lot of the research actually shows that the post-migration factors tend to have a bigger effect on people's current functioning than even sort of those pre-migration traumas and stressors that we might think of as driving their current sort of condition. But the reality is, you know, a lot of these families face a lot of discrimination. And I try to imagine myself, like if I next month had to go get groceries in Kabul, or, you know, navigate a bus system in Rwanda and figure out transportation, how overwhelming all of those sort of daily things would be for me. And this is what those families are dealing with on a daily basis. And so I try to understand, where are you living? Who's living with you? Are the kids enrolled in school? If so, are they in like a newcomer classroom, or are they exposed to, you know, English as a second or third or fourth language, or are they sort of in a regular classroom? Are there other kids? Are there other kids from their community of origin who are in school with them? Trying to understand even the things sort of at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs are important too, like food, and what is the family doing for you know, medical care? How are they getting around? Do the parents have gainful employment, or who's helping them with that? Do they feel safe in the neighborhood where they're living? There's a lot of cultural changes, obviously, that these families are subjected to, and different generations are able to manage those changes in different ways. And so oftentimes there's this discordant adjustment between, you know, the kids who sort of pick up things in their new culture a little bit quicker, and the parents who feel like the kids are relinquishing values from their culture of origin. And this can lead to some discord within the home as well. So screening for those things, changes in gender roles, discrimination, like I mentioned, are really important pieces to think about. And then I think this was one of the questions that had come up yesterday that hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a lot about today, but finding a way to connect the family with their sort of cultural groups within their new home or their new community can go a very long way. So this can be sometimes religious or faith-based organizations, language-based groups, community organizations that are centered around a regional identity. Those connections can go a really, really long way, in addition to sort of these formal resettlement agencies and nonprofits and things like that. So for the sake of time, I'll leave that post-migration stuff there. And then the last thing that I wanted to share based on my experience is that one thing I kind of remind myself is there's always a delicate balance between thinking about the broad cultural paradigms of the family that I'm sitting across from. So for example, you know, if I'm sitting with a family from Afghanistan, I might have some preconceived notions in my mind about the religious background of this family, their approach to gender interactions, to schooling, to different occupations. But I need to balance that with the reality that every family is different, and that this family that I'm meeting with right now may not ascribe to those you know, in some way stereotypes or those templates that I have in my mind. And so I think balancing those things are really important. And one thing that I found is if I'm ever unsure about what a particular family wants in terms of do they want a male interpreter or a female interpreter based on some gender interaction, cultural preference, I just try to ask as humbly and openly as I can, and I find that that tends to go pretty well. And so I think that's the last piece of advice that I would give during this section, is to just encourage people to ask if they feel that they're having trouble navigating this balance between a culture of origin and sort of the broad patterns that exist within that culture and the family that you're meeting with, and whether those two things align or not. And so for the sake of time, I will leave it there, and then I'm happy to answer questions, talk about other things during the Q&A part as well.
Thank you so much, Kashif. Yeah, just a reminder, please, if you have content questions that we can get to at the end, please put those in the Q&A box. I will stop screen sharing because I think we're going to Kira now, and I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Kashif. I was just making notes about all kinds of things that I so wholeheartedly agree with, and just really appreciated you sharing. So thank you so much for that. That was awesome. I'm hoping I can just sort of tag on to so many of those great points that you were just making. You know, it's kind of difficult to know where to start, because this is such an important issue, and it's becoming more of an important issue across the globe, really, both internally and sort of externally, and certainly with people coming to the United States as well. So one of the applications of my work is really around trying to increase the level of cultural competence and understanding that people who do clinical work in private practice or in a hospital or a clinical setting might sort of improve their ability to, serve different populations from different places in an appropriate way. And that's kind of where I'm coming from with this perspective. I really appreciated Kashif's comment about agency and learning from the people that you're serving and working with about how much agency they perceived that they had or that they had in the context of their migration or their journey. And also the comment around how the post-migration period really, that adaptation can be just as or more perspective. I'm sorry, just read that in the chat, just as or more traumatic or stressful for a family than the previous part. And making an assumption or a series of assumptions is really where we can go sideways on a lot of this work. It's really important to try to come from a perspective and a background of cultural competence. And I'm going to give some examples of that in a second, but then also to learn more and be willing to ask questions, balancing not putting a asylee or a refugee family in the position of having to educate you, right, about their culture in general. So the balance is around doing your work, becoming competent. That's a basic professional ethical obligation, I think, that many of us have. And then also humbly asking for details and more specifics when it's appropriate with individual families that are navigating these situations. So starting with learning that sense of agency. And then one of the questions that we were asked to answer today or to address in our talk is about, the question said specifically, what experiences of trauma do communities face during their migration process and resettlement? What are the effects on their mental health? And I guess what I wanted to do in response to that question was to mention that first you need to find out whether they're part of a community. Are they here alone? There's always a community that is potentially available, but many people might not have access to it, might not be aware of how to connect with it. And so the potential psychological risks related to people being isolated and for families being, or individual people coming and being isolated and alone and not feeling connected to a community and having to go through this process basically in an isolated way can be sort of objectively much more traumatic than when people are part of a group together. So there is no assumption, I don't think, that it is whole communities that are migrating together, but it can be individual people, individual families for sure. And so part of the aspect of recovery, resilience, and growth is around that community connection, which is something that people can certainly, professionals can certainly connect folks with. I want to make a distinction also between like disaster response versus sort of clinical therapy. And the really nice distinction that Kashif made around that same issue was the difference between trying to do trauma therapy and really like find out more about traumatic specific events versus meeting a need that's right there in front of you right now. What is the most applicable sort of the Tylenol for the headache or something that can be done in the moment that's really appropriate, that's going to give that individual or that family a sense of some progress being made or a sense of safety or security or a next step that's being done, rather than the process that is sort of clinical trauma therapy that requires the establishment of a therapeutic relationship and a much more long-term type of relationship. So disaster response is a very different set of tools. It's a different set of clinical skills than the kinds of things that you might use in a traditional clinical or therapy setting. In terms of general areas of consideration when working with displaced refugee or asylee communities, these are the, I guess, 7 things that I wanted to kind of bring up today. Number 1 is how important it is to recognize the difference in how people communicate distress and health. From a cultural lens and from an expressive lens, there are vastly different ways in which a distress, mental health, mental illness, fear, and anger are expressed and displayed. And so making assumptions and getting your competency around how those things show up, rather than immediately judging or evaluating something as being pathological when it is in fact not, is a really, really important first step. So the communication and the expression of distress and health is number one. Similarly, the expression of grief and loss. There are many, many different ways for people to express grief and loss. That can be an outward visible sign, things like wearing black. There are different time frames that are associated with the expression of grief and loss that are in place for a lot of different reasons, cultural and religious as well. And so having a basic understanding about the norms around the expression of grief and loss and what that actually, what are the meanings behind it, not just what things look like on the outside, whether or not someone is physically emoting versus whether or not they're very stoic and held together. That doesn't necessarily mean in either direction that there is an acute trauma, which I'm going to talk about in a second with the regard to not labeling things as being traumatic if they in fact might not be for someone else. The third issue around communication is the expression of anger or fear. And as healthcare providers or as clinicians, I think, or responders, I think one of the things we have to be mindful of is that there's an interesting dichotomy that can take place with healthcare and medical. Oftentimes, thankfully, I suppose, many of us are seen as sort of safe people. We might have anger directed towards us because we're a safe target in some ways for that distress, maybe. And in other cases, people can experience what we refer to as sanctuary trauma, where they go to a medical facility or a provider feeling like they should be in a safe space and then be labeled, be condescended to, be treated inappropriately. So there is a really interesting dichotomy around the sense of safety that can come with engaging in a healthcare setting, in a sort of traditional healthcare setting, from the perspective of people who are coming newly arrived to the United States. I mentioned a second ago the assumptions regarding trauma or the expression of trauma. That's a word that we talk about in the United States a lot. We throw that word around. It's not necessarily always appropriate or often appropriate to be labeling someone else's experiences as being traumatic. We can still talk about the physiological manifestations, the neurological challenges. If someone's having difficulty sleeping or trouble concentrating, we can talk about those things because that's the way that they're being expressed to us. But it doesn't require sort of that DSM labeling over the top of it to make sense of someone else's experience or even appropriately describe it. The fifth thing on the list is something that I think as clinicians we might tend to do on a regular basis, is making assumptions about other people's familiarity with certain coping skills or techniques or suggestions. So we might suggest, like I might suggest to a client in my private practice to try some mindfulness and walk them through that sort of a brief mindfulness exercise and teach them how to do that. You don't want to make assumptions about functional coping skills. You want to learn more about what they're already doing that works for them to start, and then try to build off of that. So rather than coming in from the side with some brand new technique or an evidence-based type of an intervention, right, that might work over here, learn more first about what are the things that are helping you regulate, helping you feel better, helping you sleep. What are the things that your friends and family and neighbors are doing? And then learning from that to build off of that to make any additional suggestions. In a lot of my international work, when we do disaster response, we take bubbles for kids to practice deep breathing, to learn how to do that regulation. And one of the things I learned early on was that if you tell people in a refugee camp to work on blowing bubbles, if you don't bring them yourself, right? One of the pieces of feedback that I learned from quite a bit was that we're not going to waste soap. That is a very important thing on bubbles for the kids. That's not a useful, use of that tool. Big learning moment for me, right? So when we do international work, we always take little bubble blowing kits and wands to get kids to practice that breathing, but we never assume and we never suggest anymore to use soap as a resource for having kids work on deep breathing, because one might not be as big of a priority as something else. So that's just an example of being aware of not making assumptions around functional activities and coping skills in terms of resources that people may have available, because you're not using information about what's already working for them first. The sixth thing on the list is the importance of spiritual care and religion. 80% of the human beings on the planet practice or sort of are identifying with some type of religion, and sort of ignoring or negating spiritual and religious care in trauma recovery, in adaptation and assimilation is a huge problem. It's something that we really need to be aware of, and offering the appropriate types of support for people. So again, having the cultural norms as an understanding of a background, learning specifically about the practices of the family or the individual that you're working with and supporting, and then working on incorporating that aspect into support for them. The last thing is that I guess would be on my list is gender norms. Just having some understanding about how differently things play out with both age and gender in different cultures, and awareness of when it's appropriate to be, alone in a room with someone of a different gender or a different age, or a mixed group of people, because those things vary dramatically and can create a really extreme sense of discomfort or comfort for somebody, depending on what they're used to and what you're kind of asking them to do, rather than just assuming this is just kind of what we do in this setting, to learn a little bit more about that first. One of an additional sort of tip that I've learned over the years is that, and I think Kashif mentioned this a little bit too, it's really important to use professional translators when at all possible, and to not ask people to translate who are members of that community, or especially within the family. As healthcare providers, we really run some strong risks of doing harm with that. And if our first ethical obligation is to do no harm, when a direct family member is being asked to translate in a healthcare setting, they then potentially have information and confidential information about what that person's experience has been that places them potentially at risk. There are examples I can give you about how this can play out in a worst case scenario, but it really is challenging when people use less than professional means. Sometimes that's the only thing you have, but often it's important to try to use professionals as much as you can in that context. So I think I'm out of time. Thank you, Christina, for popping back on.
There's so much information. I know we could sit with all of you for days and barely scratch the surface. So thank you so much for summarizing some really key points there, and balancing and enhancing, complementing what Kashif had shared. And I'm very excited to have Erman now take us home from your perspective, and then we'll get to the Q&A. We have one question in there plus a couple from yesterday, but please keep throwing them in, and we'll be back in just a little bit when you're finished. Thanks, Erman.
Thank you for the transition, Christina. I'm just sitting here listening to Kashif and Kira's recommendations and suggestions, and just really resonating with everything that's been said so far. And I want to echo a couple of things that they mentioned that I want to focus on a bit more. I think Kashif mentioned the psychological strengths that are already present in many immigrants, immigrant individuals, refugees, immigrant communities, and the importance of asking what works for them. I think Kira mentioned this as well. Asking the questions and getting a little bit more familiar with what's actually working for our clients. They also mentioned the importance of community, of building community post-migration once in the US, and what a powerful protective factor this can be in moderating or reducing potential for trauma and harm. So I really want to echo those thoughts. I know that in healthcare here in Western healthcare and mental health services, even in academia, as providers or scholars might think of ourselves as experts, right? And there's this assumption that we have the training and the skills, and that we know how to help people. And I just want to point out that immigrants, folks all over the world have been taking care of their mental health before they ever come into contact with a provider. And folks around the world from different cultural backgrounds, from various regions, have been taking care of their mental health for centuries in a way that makes sense to them. And so I think that if nothing else, I would love to emphasize this idea that it is the refugees that we work with, the asylum seekers, the immigrants who are the experts of their own experience, and we can learn so much from them, and that they have so many psychological strengths that are already helping them navigate the difficult transition of migrating to the U.S. or to different parts of the world. With that, I want to share 4 resources that I had the sincere honor of working on with a group of providers and scholars and community activists who identify as immigrants themselves. Many of them are formerly undocumented or currently undocumented. Some of them are refugees, and some of them are second-generation immigrants. So they might come from immigrant families. And I think it's often difficult to find resources that are developed for us by us. And so perhaps this is something that is special, perhaps, about these resources. I don't know. But these resources are for guiding direct mental health services, also for training and education, for developing culturally competent practice through our training and education in psychology and in mental health care. There's also a resource for advocacy, and a resource for research sort of related activities about immigrant mental health. And so I'll tell you a little bit about each of these resources. I know that we have limited time, so I won't be able to go too in depth into each of these, but I hope that this will be a good reading and a good resource for the future. The first one is a guide that was put together by a group of formerly or currently undocumented immigrant mental health providers. And the resource was developed in collaboration with some national immigrant rights organizations. And it centers on how do we respond to mental health needs in relation to shifting immigration policies. If there's something that truly shapes truly shapes and complicates, I think, the experience of immigrants and refugees post-migration, in my opinion, it is immigration policy and how much it changes, and how restrictive it can be, and how exclusionary and racist certain immigration policies can be. They shape virtually everything that immigrants and refugees are able to do, that they have the right to do once in the US. So immigration policy can truly constrain somebody's options for educational, higher education opportunities, or for whether they have access to certain health services and social services, what kind of work they can do, and what kinds of work-related rights they have access to. So immigration policy can be truly a really powerful entity, I think, in immigrants and refugees day to day. So we came together because the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, DACA, was being heard by the Supreme Court at that time. And it was uncertain whether the program would be protected or whether it would go away. And losing this protection from the DACA program, which protects over 700,000 undocumented youth who came to the U.S. And it also touches their families and communities. Losing this protection would be traumatic in every sense of the word for the immigrant community, for DACA recipients. And so in order to be proactive about this, we identified the need to train mental health providers to be able to work with this community in a culturally competent way, and to be able to provide this training rather quickly. And so we developed this guide in 2020, in the height of the pandemic, and the guide has been downloaded thousands of times from the Informed Immigrant website, and we've also gotten to share the guide through multiple webinars that have reached a few thousand providers. So luckily, this has been spread widely. And the recommendations come from our own experience as immigrants, as well as the experience of being trained mental health providers who work with immigrants and refugees and who work in these communities pretty much every day. And many of the recommendations are similar to what Kashif and Kira mentioned in terms of having cultural humility, listen to the stories, listening to the unique experience of each person, learning about their culture, exploring the post-migration experience, including the impact of COVID-19, as well as identifying biases and misconceptions that we might hold about immigration and about immigrants, reviewing existing models and recommendations for clinical work, trying to integrate trauma-informed care and multicultural competencies within our services, and then also using strategies for identifying and strengthening psychological strengths that might already be there, psychological strategies that they might be using already, as well as connecting with community resources, legal support, education programs, financial help, health services, and other communities of support, so that as a provider, you're not doing this work alone. And I think one of the most poignant recommendations is to, as providers, to learn the basics of the immigration system, of immigration policy, and to also find a way to stay attuned to policy changes on a regular basis, if possibly every couple of weeks or so on, because there truly have been so many changes to immigration policy within the past few years. It's really hard to keep track. And again, this policy context truly can shape and constrain or free what somebody's agency can be and their psychological well-being in this context of constant changes. And in these resources, we included several links for further reading for anyone who might be interested in continuing to explore those. And we made some recommendations for sources to stay attuned to immigration policy changes. The next resource is about training and education. So how do we actually train clinicians who are culturally competent? There's actually very little scholarship being done in this area. We don't necessarily have evidence-based strategies for how to train providers to specifically work with immigrants. These are very scarce kinds of resources. And so what we did is we applied the clinical recommendations guide that I just shared and turned it into three-part training that we delivered in a series of webinars much like these. Something that was unique about those webinars is that they were provided and they were delivered by immigrants of color and specifically by DACA recipients. And there was a dialogue sort of aspect to the webinar. So they weren't only content and lecture based, but they were dialogue based as well. So we applied liberatory frameworks to how we facilitated those webinars. And then we did a research study to see if these kinds of brief trainings, 90 minutes each, had any kind of impact on mental health providers' cultural competencies for working with immigrants and refugees. And what we found through pre, post, and follow-up assessments is that there were significant changes in the competencies that folks reported as a result of attending a webinar like this. And so I'm linking this article here on the chat. And we provide some details about the content of those trainings, and I'm happy to share a bit more about those as well. The next resource that I wanted to share has to do with policy advocacy, and again, acknowledging that immigration policy can have a tremendous impact on immigrants' daily experience and the kinds of opportunities that are available to them. And acknowledging that immigration policy is not always just, and it can become more humane and much more inclusive of different groups of immigrants from different parts of the world. There's a real need for policy advocacy that is targeted toward creating these kinds of changes. And so the research that I'd like to share came from a project. Oh, I'm seeing that there's some questions in the chat. I just posted the resources there again. The research about advocacy came from something that we call the Inter-Divisional Immigration Project. It was formed by multiple divisions of the American Psychological Association, APA, in 2019, and was supported by grant funding from APA as well. And what we did with this project is we actually formed 5 groups of psychologists and mental health providers based on regional location in the US. And so there was a West region and a Southwest and a Northeast and so on. And then we connected with local immigrant rights organizations, activist organizations that are at the forefront of advocating for policy change within each of these regions. And what we did is we facilitated a number of dialogues, what we called critical dialogues, where we did much of what Kashif and Kira suggested. We actually asked about their experience with the changing policies, the kind of trauma that they saw in the community, and what they recommended for mental health providers to support their advocacy efforts. And from these numbers of critical dialogues, we drafted this advocacy report that provides many recommendations for advocacy at the regional level, as well as advocacy nationally. And so those resources are there, and I hope that those are helpful to you all. And then the last piece I wanted to highlight before we transition is the Latinx Immigrant Health Alliance. This is a group of Latinx immigrant researchers across the country who are working with community organizations and doing community-based participatory action research a lot of it is intervention research, and you can see some of the resources that we have on that website too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know, like every wonderful training, there's never enough time, but I just want to thank all of our panelists today for advocating and working in these parts of the field. Your commitment to these population and groups and communities, your expertise is so invaluable. If we can have you all come back on camera, we do have some questions in the Q&A and a couple from yesterday. So I'm going to see what we can get through in the next 15, 20-ish minutes. So thanks for people that have put questions in there. And I don't know how to tackle them all, but let's start with the first one that we got. As mental health professionals, how do you bring up the topic of trauma, especially to those that may not even know what that is or how to define that, or been exposed to what that is? So I think this came when Kashif, when you were speaking probably, but anyone can share an answer.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it first. So I think one thing that I do, and I'd be curious to hear if other people approach this in different ways, because again, I think there's not necessarily a single right answer, but I think sometimes I don't even necessarily use the word trauma. I just talk about sort of things in the words that the kid or the family is using. And so if they talk about sadness or tension, and you know, you'll get a sense as you work with particular communities that there might be certain phrases that are more common in terms of how trauma or stress or whatever the term is expressed or felt in that, you know, region. And so I'll try to use the words that they're using or the direct translation of the words they're using. And I may not even necessarily mention trauma off the bat. And I might just talk about, you know, the sadness that you're feeling or the difficulty falling asleep that you're having is something that's incredibly common with people who've been through similar things. And, you know, I'll start with that and sort of just ask them to tell me more about what that's like for them, what their understanding is of why that's happening and how that's handled or addressed in the culture of origin that they're coming from, and sort of use that as a base. But I'm happy to hear what other people think and how they approach that as well.
I do the same. I don't use that word unless it is meaningful or relevant right then. In that, I mean, I'm a big fan of not labeling something as something unless there's a reason to do it, right? Not just to throw those terms around. And so clinically, I look for functional impairment, right? Things that interfere with someone's ability to function, sleep, eating, you know, whether they're depression symptoms of things. You don't have to label it or call it as trauma. You can write down things in clinical notes if you need to, but yeah, the use of the particular language is not something that I think I stick with a lot.
All right. Herman, did you want to respond to that or just move on to the next question?
No, I completely agree. I completely agree about, especially about using the client's own language and having them define what it is and what it means to them. Yeah.
I just have to mention yesterday, it felt the same way. I mean, these are important, specific contexts to talk about clinical care. And at the same time, it's like wisdom that everyone could use anywhere, right? So I just struck with, oh yeah, I used to think of that when I was doing street outreach, you know? So yeah. Okay, another question was, as mental health professionals, nope, sorry, there's a different one. This one I think came from Kira's part, but anyone can answer. On the topic of interpreters, we often struggle when clients or patients say they really prefer things to be interpreted by their family members. So we want to respect their preference, but also be safe and follow those guidelines that I know you have mentioned and all of you probably have felt before for very good reasons. So is there any more you could say when we're trying to adhere to these best practices, but the person is actually saying, I want this to go through this other channel?
I really want to hear from the other panelists on this too, but this is really tricky. There can be a lot of reasons why that person might be saying that. There might be some pressure or sense of like a threat or something that that we all have to keep it within, and so don't tell someone on the outside. I don't know. I mean, there are lots of reasons why this happens. One of my good colleagues in Jordan was working with a family, and a young girl in the family said the same. And her father was translating for her, and he was actually the one that was abusing her. And so there are cycles that can continue. What I would recommend, and again, really want to hear from the other panelists here, is that one of the ways to go around that, if you really feel like there is a concern around safety, is to say that it's just the policy, right? This is how we have to use this person here. We're sorry, even if that's a little uncomfortable. That's not always the right thing to do. I mean, it really does depend on the circumstances. But if you say that it's a clinical policy of the facility, then it takes the pressure off of the person and having to, especially if it's a minor, like having to say no or yes. It's just the way it is here. And if you're concerned at all about something happening that's untoward, then that's probably the better option. But that's my two cents.
Yeah, and I have a very similar take, I think, on that. I think it's very context dependent. And I think one thing that I try to do when this comes up for me is to try to elicit why the family is requesting that. You know, like what's the reason that they are requesting the family member to be an interpreter? It ends up, I think, being one of two things. Like Kira mentioned, is sometimes there's some comfort or there's some reason why they want the family member to do it, or the flip side is there's some discomfort they have with the interpreter. And I think once you understand that, it makes it easier to sort of problem solve around that. And so there have been times where they've requested a family member, and after sort of fleshing it out a little bit, it was because they actually knew the interpreter. You know, they were like 2-3 degrees of separation away, and they were worried that it was sort of going to get out within the community. And so then once you understand those pieces, it's a little bit easier to work around. Or, you know, in a lot of my patients from Afghanistan, as many of you know, there's 2 main languages in Afghanistan, Pashto and Dari, and they're not perfectly mutually intelligible. And so if you have a family that's Pashto speaking and an interpreter who speaks Dari as their first language, but maybe knows a little bit of Pashto, they may be worried about the sort of integrity of the translation and whether things are going to get lost, which is a very valid concern. And then you can sort of problem solve around that. And so really just trying to understand what it is that the hesitancy that they're having can clue in quite a bit.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also want to mention the cost to family members, and especially for youth, to be in that translator role. It can be a little bit burdensome to have to translate it, especially if there are medical terms or psychological terms that you might not be familiar with. And when there's diagnosis involved and so on, there's quite a bit at stake. And so having that translator can actually relieve a family member from being in that position of having to really make sense of the medical situation for that person. I've been in that situation myself, where I was with a family member at the hospital and they provided an interpreter, and what a relief it was to not have to do that translating back and forth. And it also allowed me to fill in certain things that the interpreter left out. So there are ways that the family member can still be involved and help without having them be the only ones who are responsible for that communication.
That's a great point. It's very complex. I know it's a big field and aspects around that. We did have a question, and we talked quite a bit about this yesterday as well, but how can we help support mental health or resilience when the stigma of mental health is so present? And I think each of you sort of touched on that in a way. Just wondering if you have like a quick response to that. It's not a quick answer, of course, but you know, this is a big thing that we heard a lot in the voices and stories yesterday as well.
Yeah.
In my oh, go ahead, Kasha.
Go ahead, Kira.
No, you first.
So I guess one thing that I think about is it took some time for me to realize, I think, why stigma can be much more pronounced in other places. And I think once I had an appreciation for that, it did a lot for me. And so I think realizing that the reason that stigma is oftentimes more salient in a particular culture is because sometimes there's very real repercussions to a person publicly talking about their difficulties with their emotions or whatever it might be. In many of the communities that our families are coming from, there's not an FMLA, there's no 504 plan or IEP for kids who are struggling with depression or ADHD or whatever it is. And people can't get that job if they talk about what they're struggling with. They can't attend that school. They may be subjected to institutionalization that works very differently than it does in the US. And in these collectivist societies where marriage may work differently than it does here, they may not be able to marry that person or marry into that family or whatever if their difficulties with mental health are public. And so I think once I appreciated how real those consequences can feel for people in those other situations, it helped me understand why it's hard to talk about, and then talk about the ways that maybe those same things, those concerns about job security or schooling or institutionalization may not be as concerning in our context, did a lot to alleviate that stigma once we sort of understood what the stigma was about. Yeah.
I would just say that when we're doing international work, one of the things that we try to focus on with regard to that is some of the neuroscience. You strip away all of the outside stuff and all the clothes and the religion and all the things on the outside that people see, and you talk about the brain. And it's actually really surprising to me how, whether these are high school students or whether these are moms, or it doesn't matter. People can identify with pieces of describing sort of how the brain responds to stuff. And it takes some of that social cultural pressure off of the idea of mental health when it's chemical and it's physical. So we depending on the group and the audience, but sometimes we do that too.
Yeah, thinking about stigma, what I would add, maybe connecting it back to immigration policy and to the way that some immigrants or a lot of immigrants are treated in the US, and the discrimination that I think was mentioned earlier. We actually recently published a study where we developed an instrument called the Stigma of Illegality scale, and it actually measures multiple forms of stigma related to how immigrants are perceived as being undocumented, and the criminalization of immigrants, of people who come from somewhere else. And we actually found that that stigmatization is present across immigration statuses, regardless of whether somebody's undocumented or not. And it's actually linked to higher mental health distress, so higher depression and anxiety. And so it really points to the social conditions that are driving stigma and mental health distress here in the US after immigrants and refugees arrive.
Thank you. So I have still a few questions I'm going to kind of weave together, but I see, Kira, you're responding to JG in the Q&A. I would say, please do your answer. I would say, the question is, how often does spirituality factor into resiliency? I mean, I think that's very dependent, but we heard a lot about that yesterday from folks that, as you were mentioning, Kira, this is a very common experience for people to have spirituality, have religion. And so I don't know if there's anything more you would add to that, but I think it's very complex, but it's possibly just more prominent than maybe the average person in the US.
I can be really brief about this. Mm-hmm. There used to be in Western American psychological research and thought this idea that having an internal locus of control where you are responsible for what happens to you was a good thing for resilience. And subsequent research has shown that in traumatic, disaster, and really overwhelming situations for people, that the presence of a higher power and putting that external focus of locus of control, where what is happening to me is out of my hands, it is in the hands of God, or it is in the hands of a different power, is actually can be very relieving. So the research originally said, no, you want an internal locus of control, and now it's actually saying, not so much. Actually, an external locus of control under certain circumstances for people who, you know, really have been through a traumatic kind of a situation might get a strong sense of relief from feeling like that their path is determined or predetermined by a higher power. So that can definitely support resilience. In classic clinical psychology terms, it all depends. But yeah.
Right. So here's a question that we had yesterday, and it's you know, more on the systems end. So I want to make sure we get a couple of these in before we have to wrap up. So given that community, a sense of community is so important, and especially for people's mental health, are there initiatives that facilitate, this is what the question was yesterday, initiatives that facilitate established refugees helping new refugees integrate themselves in a new country while still honoring cultural traditions? Any thoughts or responses? Please take it away.
Yeah, I think, like, you know, like Kira said, a lot of this, it's dependent on the particular case and the particular community. And I'll give some examples of interventions here in Connecticut that I've really liked watching develop. And I should say, before I mention the interventions themselves, that all of these things were sort of organically, just like people came in like, hey, what if we did this? And so now they have these fancy acronyms and all this funding, but it was really just people coming together and saying, like, what are the sort of interests for this community, the strengths from this particular refugee community, and how can we sort of leverage that and increase the capacity of it. And so there are some really cool interventions where a lot of the refugee moms have developed this, it's like a restaurant basically, or a catering service where they cook foods from their countries of origin. And then, you know, it's one of the most popular sort of food options in New Haven. And so it's a way for these moms to come together where there's a strong sense of isolation. And now they have this opportunity to connect with moms from their own sort of country, but also from other refugee populations. So there's a nice intra-community and inter-community connections that are formed through these kinds of social interventions. And then you have families that have been in the States for more, you know, for a longer time, who are helping to, you know, inculcate those newer families into those networks. And the same thing happens with, you know, the dads in playing cricket and the kids in playing soccer and all these kinds of things, newcomer classrooms and summer learning programs. And so I think it's really just about getting a sense for what the particular opportunities are in your community, and then finding a way to like formalize them. I hope that answers. I think that's hopefully getting at the question that you guys are asking.
I could follow up if that's okay. And Kasia, if I really appreciate the idea of the cooking and restaurant, that just sounds like such an amazing way of building community. Just incredible, and food is so central, right, to so much culture and so much meaning attached to it. I want to share about this organization called InSchools. They partner with K-12 schools to provide a number of educational interventions. Some of the programs are directly for immigrant and refugee communities. And some of them are for educators, and there are some programs for education leaders. And the idea is, how do we shift the culture of the school so that it can become more inclusive and welcoming and safer for undocumented immigrants? And we're beginning to do some research about the efficacy of what they're doing and so on. And there's so much room, I think, to incorporate mental health into these kinds of programs. And I know that universities in higher education have done a lot through undocumented resource centers that do something similar in terms of trying to shift the culture to be more inclusive and safer spaces, sanctuary spaces for undocumented immigrants and refugees.
I was just thinking of a place I worked for a long time. Of all the mental health groups at the mental health center that were popular, it was the Latino, Latinx, Hispanic group where it was food. It was not called something that was a diagnosis label. It was just a good time, and people always came, and everyone else was wondering why their group was so popular. Well, you have food and you have community and you don't label people. It was pretty amazing. Last question. I know we're going to have just more as we roll in, but I know we have to round the corner here. From yesterday, this is on the systems level. Aside from voting, what are practical and impactful things individuals can do to support changes in national policies regarding immigration in the US? So, in 30 seconds, if you could quickly tell us how to fix this problem we're in, that would be fantastic.
I don't know that I have any. I think it needs to start on a local level where you can actually have an impact in terms of efficacy and influence. So building out. I'm not as familiar with sort of the larger national structures, but I do some work on a local level with individual groups who do political lobbying and that kind of a thing. So starting where you're connected, who, Rule 7 I have a bunch of rules for my own self, but Rule 7 is you got to know somebody. And so, connecting yourself with people that are connected to others, in whether those are professional on LinkedIn or whether those are just, contacts that you make and working out through those connections. I don't have anything more specific.
I know you mentioned some of this, Herman, in some of your talk. I don't know if you had a particular thought.
Yeah, the report that I mentioned earlier, there are many strategies there, and we also named many local organizations that are focused on this kind of advocacy. So I think that connecting with your local group is a great way to start. And then this organization called Forward.us, they do national work, and they're focused in DC. And they're a great organization to follow for policy advocacy.
Christina, you're
I
on
mute
mute.
again. I know, it's so great when I do that. I just want to thank all of you. I know we have to get to some closing slides, but I just wanted to thank all of you, Kasha, Herman, Kira, for sharing just amazing thoughts and wisdom. It was so great to hear you bounce off each other with ideas, and that's the beauty of a panel. So I just wanted to run through one of the things that we would love to hear from you, and I'm sorry we didn't get to every last question, is a little closing activity. If you can put in the chat, we invite you to share something that you can do in your current role or your agency to with a lot of this information and thought-provoking conversation, what you might be able to do differently or better, or maybe in a new way to help us just understand what you got from the conversation today. So really thank all of you for participating and all of our panel. And then I think I'll turn this over to Shelby. But just thank you so much for your time. Feel free to say farewell. I didn't mean to stop that part if you wanted to, but thank you so much for your time today.
Hello again, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure today and yesterday, just bringing this session to you all and having you all engage. And as a reminder, today's presentation slides and recording, as well as access to your certificate, that's all going to be wrapped up and sent out to you in an email in about a week's time. And we're also going to make this available on our website. I believe we'll drop the link to that page in the chat box so that you can bookmark it for a later date. Next slide, please. We also want to share some resources with you all, starting with our collection of resources to support the mental health of refugees and asylum seekers. We also encourage you all to connect with your regional Mhttc so you can learn about other trainings and technical assistance activities available to you free of cost. And we also ask that you follow us on social media at Mhttc Network and subscribe to our monthly newsletter so you can stay in the loop about other programs that may interest you. And then last but not least, we do ask you to take a moment to complete a brief survey about today's training. Once you close out of the webinar window, you'll get redirected. We're also dropping the link in the chat, and you can scan the QR code using a mobile device. Yesterday, we did have some issues with the survey link not working properly, and we realized it was due to so many people logging on at the same time. So if you're unable to access it today, just know that we will be including the link in the follow-up email as well. With all that being said, I want to say thank you again to all of you who attended today. A special thank you to our panelists for helping bring our vision for this session to fruition, and also to our Building Health Equity and Cultural Responsiveness Working Group members, as well as all of our Mhttc colleagues who supported the planning for this series. I hope you all have a great weekend, and we hope to see you again in future programming. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.